Historias inspiradoras de mujeres y hombres que desde diversas realidades se convirtieron en verdaderos agentes de cambio. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a Innovadores Invisibles.
A very interesting example is in Tirúa, in the southern part of Chile. We had this massive disaster in 2010, a tsunami, and there was another tsunami, and actually the largest earthquake recorded by history in 1965 in Maldivia. The brother from the sea gets angry and sort of comes back to go to the other brother. So Mapuche, the people that from the land, which means they protect on the land, on higher ground.
Thank you very much for joining us in a new chapter of Innovadores Invisibles. Now we are with a good friend of the house with Balloon, with Cristóbal Mena. Cristóbal, thank you very much for joining us.
Glad to be here. Yeah.
Well, Cristóbal, first of all, and before you tell us who you are, why are we here? Because you choose this location, and I believe that is related to your story and also with your biography of how you relate to this subject that we are going to continue talking.
Yes, indeed. This is a very special place for me, not necessarily the place, but actually what happened here. Almost 30 years ago, we had a big landslide here in Santiago. Here's a memorial of the victims of that landslide. But it marked my life because I was in 5th grade when this landslide occurred. My school was not that far from here. And I vividly remember that time just seeing the street, how the mud was going down, rocks, dog houses, etc. And from then on, I think that something sort of clicked to me in a way of, okay, these things happen. This was my first disaster probably that I remember. And that sort of marked my life probably in the future in a way. Yeah, this is a special place for me.
Very symbolic.
Yes.
So, Cristóbal, our second question is, who is Cristóbal Mena? If you can share with us some of your story or part and what you're doing nowadays.
Well, my background, I've probably had a very strong public service vocation for a long time. I've been serving as a firefighter for almost 20 years volunteering. And in some point I tried to sort of how I took my career in a way into this sort of volunteering, how to sort of make these paths cross in a way. And I found, okay, political science, disaster risk management, policy in a way made sense. So I moved into that. So I studied political science, then I did a master's degree in London disaster management. And from then on, I've been working for almost more than 10 years in this so far. Yeah.
Not all of the people, because this podcast is listened also in different countries in US, in Europe. So not all the people know that the firefighters here in Chile, it's a vocational job. So, for example, this thing that you were talking to us that happened when you were at school, you were already a firefighter, or this is also one of the main reasons that you?
That was probably one of the reasons was that my dad was a firefighter, and that also sort of happens to be like a family tradition in a way here.
Okay.
El Cuerpo de Bomberos de Chile se fundó oficialmente el 30 de junio de 1970. Esta fecha conmemora la creación de la primera institución de bomberos en Chile, el Cuerpo de Bomberos de Valparaíso, que nació en 1851 después de un gran incendio que destruyó la calle del Cabo en Valparaíso. En Chile, cabe destacar que el Cuerpo de Bomberos es voluntario y no recibe remuneraciones.
To say here in Chile, all the firefighters are volunteer, from the chief to the youngest one, they're all volunteers. But again, I think it clicked that, okay, disasters happen. I remember that one firefighter took me to cross the street, just sort of his shoulders, just sort of crossing the street with the mud, etc., to get to my house. So I sort of linked that to public service. Then, in some point, I wanted to be a priest. Then I sort of saw that priesthood wasn't my thing, probably not religious.
How you realize that?
I thought that I think that religion tends to be more or sort of proposes to be more divine when actually it's very human, and sort of that tension for me that wasn't sort of appropriate for me. But then I realized also that what moved me wasn't actually religion, was service. And that's when I got into the fire station, and then actually I lived almost 9 years on the fire station. My house was the fire station to serve. And till now, my job it's oriented into service.
This podcast is based in social mobility and inequalities. So how this is related with risk? Or maybe you can start by answering what is risk? How anyone can understand what do we mean about risk?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And usually sometimes when we talk about risk or we talk about disasters, for instance, we hear about natural disasters. So we tend to think that's nature, that it's responsible of a disaster. But actually what it is risk. Risk, it's a probability, it's a chance of something happening. But how do we build that chance? It's because we as human beings choose some things that create that disaster. So for instance, here in the landslide prone area, what we see, and this is around the world, that usually the more poorer communities are the ones that are more affected by disasters. Why? For instance, they are the ones that tend to live in the most hazardous areas because it's where no one wants to live. So they can't choose where to live. They live where they can live. So at the end, it's
cheapest
poverty.
place, or maybe and maybe they are not paying for this. They just get there.
We see now, for instance, or in Chile, for instance, with migration, we've seen it in the north of Chile. There are there's several areas that are very prone to landslides. And nowadays we've seen that in those areas we're observing a huge amount of these sort of shanty towns or informal settlements in those places. Probably because they don't know that they're settling there, because they come from other countries that they don't have sort of historical knowledge. But also, as you say, it's where they can. Probably it's what we saw tragically in the wildfires now in the summer in Chile, that almost 40-50% of the houses that were burned. We had 7,000 houses burned this summer due to a wildfire in Myanmar. And of those, around 40-50% were informal settlements. So again, it's nature which is responsible, or it's the underlying conditions of poverty, of gender disparity, of not having inclusive development, which actually leads to create disasters.
And it's interesting because if we start reading about disaster in the past, most of those disasters were attribute to the gods, divine thing that is happening to all these people, and this is something that is nature, something that is divine, but not all the time is responsible of people. So I really like when you explain risk in this dimension of exposure in the resilience. Can you talk more about that, and so people can understand that risk is not just the chance, and how you can reduce those chances are these dimensions that are inside? Yeah.
El concepto riesgo tiene un origen etimológico amplio y ambiguo, que por un lado significa algo que nos llega providencialmente, como también se refiere a una situación peligrosa, demostrando que es un concepto con una definición positiva como también negativa. En resumen, al hablar de riesgo nos referimos a una circunstancia de peligro donde no hay seguridad y el resultado no está garantizado. Veamos cómo Cristóbal nos define este concepto en razón a la gestión de riesgos y desastres naturales.
Of course. Actually, the term disaster comes from the Greek, that it's disastrous. So it's the lack of a star, the lack of luck. So again, as you say, we were sort of blaming the gods that this happened. Then we moved to natural disasters. So then we say, okay, it seems that it's nature, probably in the Enlightenment. We start to understand, okay, when the ground shakes, the buildings fall, so it's nature's fault. But now, probably in the last 40-50 years in academia, we've realized that actually it's, for instance, gender disparities. There's a very good study in Bangladesh. It's a very disaster-prone country, particularly with floodings, when they realized that per one man that died on a flooding, 4 women died. Wow. So you say, well, it's nature? No, it's something in society that explains this, which is women there are malnourished. Women there, they don't teach them to swim because it's a men's thing, so they don't know how to swim. When they're menstruating, they feel dirty, so they can't leave the house. And also, because of their religion, they can't expose their body, so they can't take out the clothes when they're in a flood. So you start seeing all those elements, nothing to do with nature, which explains why these women die much more often than men. And when we talk about exposure, it's the same thing. We choose where to build. It's not a chance. Probably when we're talking with the poor people, probably they don't choose, but most of the urban cities choose where to put things. And that's again, it's our fault. It's our choice. So if we choose to build a school in a tsunami-prone area, and then the school floods and we had kids dying, it's not nature's fault. It's our fault of poor urban planning, of taking bad decisions that put that school in an exposed area. So again, when we're talking about natural disasters, nature is just probably the trigger. But there are a lot of prior conditions and prior actions that explain why these hazards become disasters.
Super interesting what you're saying, because most of the time that, or maybe I imagine we can reduce this, how we can prepare. Maybe a lot of people are going to start talking about technology, how we're going to improve these buildings, this capacity. But all the things that you were saying are more cultural things. So cultural things are systemic challenge. So tell us, how is the preparation? How is the prevention work for this, and how this is shown in different communities? There is an inequality in the way that we prepare for this with different people? How governments or private sector are investing?
On your question first, I think it's really interesting when we talk about technology. A very, very interesting example is in Tirúa, in the southern part of Chile. We had this massive disaster in 2010, a tsunami, and there was another tsunami, and actually the largest earthquake recorded by history in 1965 in Maldivia. Both earthquakes produced massive disasters. And in both earthquakes, a lot of the people that died was because of the tsunami. But in Tirúa, no one died.
Why?
And the question is like, why? So we talk about, and one of the things that happened in 2010 is that one of the failures was technology. And we didn't have early warning systems, so we didn't have sirens, messaging systems. So that's why people didn't know to evacuate, or they evacuated and they came back to the zone before, etc. So explain why they died. So say, well, in Tirúa, what happened?
Did they have those kind of technology? Maybe no.
So probably one would say, oh, they had like great technology. They were, and the thing is, no, they had very traditional knowledge. There's a myth in the Mapuche culture that's called the Trentenga Negai, which is two snakes. One comes from the sea, one comes from the land, and they're like brothers, and like good brothers, they fight each other. There's a tradition that sort of when the ground shakes, the brother from the sea gets angry and sort of comes back to go to the other brother. So Mapuche, the people that from the land, which means they protect on the land, on higher ground.
They know that it was coming.
So they know in a way that, okay, when the ground shakes, basically, they know that the sea comes and that the way of protecting, it's going to higher ground. That's sort of disaster preparedness 101 easily, and that's, I think, that's coming from centuries. So again, it's technology, again, not necessarily, probably something that also can help, but this is sort of a good example of when we talk about prevention. It's not only sometimes having these huge investments on technology, these huge investments on massive training, etc. Sometimes it's just grasping the local knowledge, working with the communities, probably with not so high cost, but really sort of connecting with what for them makes sense in a way. So that's one thing that we've realized, that it's really important to have like a very community-based approach with an open sort of view of what the traditional knowledge lies in there. And the other thing is that how we prepare, besides that, is of course, we know that, for instance, there are several studies that we know that for every dollar that we spend on resilience, we save $4 on damages. At least that's a study for the World Bank, There are others that say 1.7, others say 1 to 2. In all of them, we know that
It's a
putting
positive investment.
putting resources in resilience, it's an investment. It's not expenditure, because we know that there's a return. We know that it's not just money that goes into sort of an empty pocket. It's something that really reduces damage, but not only that, it strengthens the communities. Because, for instance, when we create a training on a community, probably the community, they had some knowledge of who they are, but once they train together, the levels of trust, the levels of
social
association,
capital,
and the social capital of that community grows. And that also has been studied a lot. So it's important to understand it's not only the disaster.
And now are we investing
No.
in prevention? No?
No.
Public, because most of the time you can imagine that this is a public thing. So it's the governments that had to invest. What happened with the private sector in this area?
Actually, for instance, in Chile, one thing that it's really interesting is that Chile, in the disaster law, the first article of the law says that the disaster management system is composed by the private and the public sector. That's the first sort of declaration. So we understand that the capacities from the public, from the private.
They are part of the solution and also of the problem. Okay.
So one thing that we know is that the private sector can produce a lot of knowledge, for instance, on risk. For instance, the insurance sector, they have amazing risk analysis, which they can share to have better knowledge. There's also the interest of being...
It's a huge movement on insurtechs.
Of course.
In this area.
But also about ethics. I always say that when you invest on resilience, it's an ethical way of doing business.
To remember all the tragedy that they faced in 1993. Yes. So
I think coming back to your question, I think it's a really good point that she was asking to be respectful, but also that when we talk about how we prepare and how we do preparedness, we talk about traditional knowledge, but also it's about memory. It's about we usually forget very quickly that disasters happen. And that's very unfortunate because there's a lot of lessons that come from each of these disasters, and probably the best way of sort of honoring the victims is through those knowledges. And I think that coming back to the question of how we prepare, I think that also creating spaces of memory, constant spaces of memory, is really, really important. And the private sector there can, of course, help on financing those spaces, on maintaining those spaces. Sometimes they are in private spaces like this one, and allowing that to become part of the community. That's also really, really relevant.
So you told us that we have a specific law for risk disaster, but also in the 22 of May, what happened?
Well, we're talking about the Valdivia earthquake in 1965. So that was the date of the Valdivia earthquake, which is the highest recorded earthquake in history, human history. And that date, in a way, was decided to be the date that in Chile, each year, we have the National Disaster Memory Day, in a way.
This is something that is used in other countries, or just
in some countries, yes. In Japan, they have like a more sort of strong culture of memory and of community, of course. That's something that's really often. Actually, I spent almost 2 months in Japan doing a course on raising awareness, and I was most of the time in Kobe, and it coincided that I was there when it was the anniversary of the commemoration of the Kobe earthquake of 1995. And they have a procession each year from the highest part of Kobe up and down to the bay with the survivors, etc., remembering what happened. And at the end, it's like a sort of disaster management fair when you can sort of know how to rescue someone, how to prepare, etc. But it's each year with all the community, and we marched from the whole city remembering that. So I think that that's exceptional. Probably Chile, Japan, some other countries, but most of the countries, they don't have that kind of connection with disaster memory. And I think that's probably one of the things that explain again why disasters happen. Not because of nature, it's because we forget of them purposefully sometimes, because for some interest, they don't want to remember that something happened here. In other cases, because it's our way of thinking. It's how our brain is wired that sort of tends to make us forget of these sort of painful memories.
You talk about the role that could take the private sector, and also this is about death, but also one of the things, as Balloon, we work in rural areas. We are working in many of the areas that have been affected by this different kind of disaster. But when we see if we can do something different, if we can do something, a big change, or maybe small changes, not only to save the assets of the people, livelihood that they have, also we are talking about life. What do you recommend to do?
Escuchemos la interesante definición en torno a lo que es el desarrollo sostenible y cómo emerge el concepto resiliencia asociado a lo anterior.
Well, I think it's important, and say particularly because when we talk about development issues and when we talk about having sustainable development in a way, a sustainable development is a development that is resilient, because it takes a lot to grow, to produce that small entrepreneurship, that local investment takes time, takes money, takes effort. And if we don't introduce resilience measures into that business, into that entrepreneurship, then we will sort of lose all that growth, all that gains in the first disaster we had. So I think it's understanding that these things will happen. It's something that they don't happen. They happen. More often in some parts, sometimes not that often, but it happens. So we have to learn and to don't forget that this is an investment. And as when you make sort of the budget, or you sort of make the analysis of this, how the business model, one of the things that you should put into account is risk. It's okay, how I'm going to reduce the risk in this entrepreneurship, in this investment, because I want this to be, in the future will be projected. And this is more relevant nowadays, particularly in the rural sectors, because of climate change. So there are parts where probably 30, 40 years ago, they didn't have wildfires or droughts or heavy floods, etc.
We are seeing that in Patagonia.
And now we're seeing that in Patagonia, for instance, and some other parts. So again, how are we introducing this kind of measures in resilient, for instance, agriculture?
That's super important. Maybe in our work, like 5 years ago, not all of the people talk about impact measurement. Now it's not a differentiation of what you're doing in any development program. All you have to measure. Now we can have this another flag to put risk inside all of the programs, not just the government programs, the private programs, because there are a lot of money invested in terms of entrepreneurship, training in different kind of stuff. So if we can put this chapter inside the budgets, like to promote this, now really, really good
I always say
recommendation.
sort of putting the risk lenses in a way. Like we can see things through several lenses, but we sometimes forget those risk lenses and also see things in a way that, okay, where I'm exposed to a certain part, my community has certain vulnerabilities, there are disabled people, there's gender gaps, etc. And once I see those elements, then I can start tackling them and start producing a sustainable development.
And I want to come back to the inequalities, to talk about women and how they are exposed on this. You gave us the example of Bangladesh, but also older people maybe are more exposure to this. So which are the biggest inequalities that you're facing in this area, or you have seen?
Well, we've seen particularly the communities that have like more special needs are the ones that usually are more affected. For instance, talking about technology again. Japan, 2011, big earthquake, big tsunami. Japan, like sort of a hallmark of good preparedness, amazing technology, but they had 15,000 deaths of the earthquake. And that was 2011. I was in Japan 2014, and I spent a week on a seminar on sociology and disasters. So I started sort of seeing what was the explanation of who died in a way. And they realized two things. Most of the people that died were elderly people, disabled people, and also it was people that they had a very strong cultural sort of trust on science. So they said, okay, the tsunami wave will reach the 28 meters. So the Japanese went there to the 29, waited there, but the tsunami wave was 30. And so then they sort of realized, okay, so what happened? We forgot about the elderly. We forgot about the disabled people. So the planning, the evacuation routes, etc., they were designed for them. So they said, okay, we didn't put the risk lenses and we didn't saw that this was happening or that this could happen. So we're seeing that with elderly people, with disabled people, with kids. We see it particularly in schools. We have some projects also in some countries where we have a program of safe schools. And the idea is that a school must be safe. It's where you're leaving your kids to be educated and you trust that they are in a safe space during those 6-8 hours where they are not in your house. And but we're seeing that there are a lot of schools that are not safe. They're exposed to hazards, they don't have plans, they don't have evacuation routes, etc. So we also see kids that are also more affected by disasters. And women, we're also seeing that, as I mentioned before, and particularly nowadays also with migrants. We're also seeing migrants because of two reasons. One, because they are in a way marginalized. Sometimes they want to sort of become formal, so they don't.
They are living maybe in those places that they don't choose to.
But also
live.
when the government wants to do training, for instance,
they don't privatize.
They train the formal community. So they go to the group of neighbors. They go to the municipality and they out to train them. But these people that are sort of marginalized, they are outside the system. How do you reach them? How do you train them? How do you make them aware of the hazards that probably are not the same that they had in their countries? So, for instance, if you have in Venezuela, you probably didn't have earthquakes. And you come to Chile, migrating, and of course, it's not in your list. But I also have to prepare for earthquakes. That's something that, and when they face one or they face a tsunami, probably they won't have any training or language barriers. We're same with in Haiti, with people that come from Haiti this year. If they don't speak Spanish and all our recommendations in Spanish, then how will they know what to do if it's not in Creole, for instance?
So you just already said that the disasters are not natural. So what are, if not naturals?
Well, one thing that we know is that besides the conditions that sort of explain why a hazard becomes a disaster, that are social, we also know that the impacts, one would think that they are sort of transversal, that everyone sort of is affected in the same way.
It's impacting the same way.
But we know that the impact is not the same. We know that it's unequal. We know that there are people that are with more vulnerabilities, who have less access to opportunities, that are probably the ones that are more affected. But we also know that, and we see it particularly on the business sector, that there's small entrepreneurs that all their effort, all their work on one disaster, that it's all lost when you don't introduce resilience measures on that investment. So we are really aware that this is a social phenomenon. Probably disasters are one of the most political social events in a society because it affects the way that we live. It affects our livelihoods. And I think that's something that we have not to forget. Again, that there are no natural disasters.
Yeah. So, well, thank you, Cristóbal, for everything you have told us, teach us. And we realize that this is not just a technology thing, it's also a cultural thing. We have to invest in prevention. We have to make the private sector also part. It's not just something that is 100% dedicated or related to the public. So thank you very much. And join us in the next chapter of Innovadores Invisibles.
Our vodcast series, Innovadores Invisibles, Voices of Progress, features inspirational stories of people who built impactful solutions that changed their lives. This collaboration is an important part of addressing wealth inequality, people who share with us their journey of upward social mobility. This is a collaboration created by Balloon Latam and the Wealth Inequality Initiative by Julius Baer Foundation. The Wealth Inequality Initiative by Julius Baer Foundation is a globally collaborative platform to awaken interest in wealth inequality, to circulate knowledge, to mobilize stakeholders, and to drive action towards more equitable solutions. Be part of our community, and together, let's embrace the role of changemakers.
Balloon Latam es una empresa B que reduce las brechas de desigualdad en la ruralidad. potencia la cohesión social a través del desarrollo de proyectos locales, espacios de vinculación y diálogo, haciendo que las comunidades sean protagonistas de su propio desarrollo. Pueden encontrar más información en www.balunlatam.com o seguirnos en nuestras redes sociales como Balun Latam, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn y Facebook. Productor ejecutivo y voz en off, Juan Ignacio Cordero. Audiovisual, Ismael Contreras. Conducción, Sebastián Salinas Claro. Marketing y comunicación, equipo Balun Latam junto a equipo Fundación Julius Baer. Traducción, equipo Julius Baer.